right. So Elizabeth, would you like to kick us off?
Yeah, my name is Elizabeth. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Oliver, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Oliver. And yeah, I work at Consensus as a day job. And the idea for this talk, we're not the only people to have come up with this concept. Other people in the space have noticed Alcoholics Anonymous's Web3-ness, so to speak. But it sort of came to me a couple of years ago that I was like, oh my God, AA is a DAO. And it's sort of grown from there. Is that fair to say, Elizabeth?
Yep.
Cool. So shall we?
Yep. So today we are going to cover why the AA case study, the relevant AA history, why people need AA, and also why they subsequently need your DAO, how to do what your DAO does, how to keep going, and the most important part, how to get paid when doing so. So those are the big overarching areas that we wanted to draw lessons from Alcoholics Anonymous for use by DAOs or other decentralized communities or communities who wish to decentralize. So the goal here is to learn, to find out what we can learn from the oldest DAO, which we are calling the oldest DAO. We are naming it that, Alcoholics Anonymous.
It's an assertion that stands until someone proves otherwise.
Yes.
So why is AA a compelling case study? We can throw these back and forth, Elizabeth. But first of all, it's permissionless. This is something that's really wild. And for those who aren't familiar with Alcoholics Anonymous, there's no reason for you to know this, but AA doesn't give permission to start a meeting or a group or anything. And you can make an AA group if you want to. One of the most a saying on this is, how does an AA group form, Elizabeth?
And two drunks get together to talk.
No. With
Oh,
with a resentment and a coffee pot,
oh,
right?
that's another way.
Yeah. In other words, you get fed up with one group and you start start another one because you want to.
Yes.
So yeah, it's decentralized. There are AA offices in different regions. Sort of like if there's enough AA in an area, there will be an office that is set up to serve that region. But it's not a management office. It's like it's a bottom up power structure, so to speak. And there might be a website or like a paper list of meetings in the area, but it's not like they tell you that, yes, we're granting you permission to open a meeting in this area. You tell them, hey, I'm going to be holding a meeting at this place at this time, and it's kind of up to you to update it. Do you want to touch on the next 2 points, Elizabeth?
Yeah. But just in case you can't read it there, it does say the only requirement for AA membership is a desire to stop drinking. So as long as you have that, you basically can be an AA member and nobody can tell you otherwise. The second reason we think this is a compelling case study is because of how decentralized it is. There are no AA offices. There are AA offices that are based on regions. Like Oliver said, they maintain lists of meetings, but they are fully opt-in registries. So people talk about like unofficial AA meetings, which are like not listed. There are some guidelines that people generally have about running meetings, but they're simply that. You can find meetings of every form and variety, pretty much most places. And now with the advent of more online communities, we've seen a proliferation of meetings in the virtual space as well, further decentralizing it. And then the third reason are the regenerative finances. So AA groups ought to be fully self-supporting, declining outside contributions. So AA is a fully self-sustaining model.
And we'll come back to that.
Everyone it pays from its own collection, similar to how many churches operate or other types of worship congregations. You know, a basket is passed, a hat is passed, a collection is taken. And that is also a fully opt-in collection.
Right.
So you are never compelled to contribute. You do it on a purely volunteer basis, and that is also not a basis for membership, right? So that's also really important to consider, that people give what they can, when they want. And that is its complete funding strategy. There is absolutely no other funding associated with it. And so really, the groups and the organization and the movement really are, they grow based on direct community decision to grow it, which is why it actually is decentralized, because it is created by people who want it when they want it. And then the next point is no rules, only suggestions. So here are the steps we took, which are suggested as a program of recovery. There is no rules in AA, only suggestions. And this goes back to its sort of decentralized, hyper-local model that has worked so well. AA was founded in 1935. It's present in about 180 countries. There are roughly 2 million members. There's never fully accurate records because, again, like, we don't keep records. And there have been translations of texts in over 100 languages. So in most places you can find some community.
Yeah. And how did it get to that point? Well, this was one of the things that I learned that made me say, oh wow, these people are absolute degens. I was reading what's the name of the book, Elizabeth?
A Brief History of AA.
No, different one. Anyway, oh, Coming of Age, the AA story. And it's a book written 20 years maybe after the founding of AA by one of the founders. The other one had already passed away, and it's lots of this. It's sort of an oral history, except written about the early days. And they were trying to publish this book, Alcoholics Anonymous, but no publisher would do it. And luckily, one of the early AA members was a recovering alcoholic stockbroker. And so he was like, fine, we have to self-publish this. We don't have the money, not a problem. And he goes to the stationery shop and he buys a bunch of just like stock certificates, which is a thing you could buy, I guess. And he sold shares in the publication of the book. So absolutely an illegal, unregistered security. And that was the money that they used. And the community got their returns eventually. So they, they did the token drop. But yeah, they basically ICO funded the book.
Full ICO funding. They
completely illegal.
They went out and they door by door, person by person, sold them stock certificates and self-funded the entire thing.
So yeah. And as Elizabeth already touched on, the organization is fully anarchical. And they did sort of establish some governance structures, but it's again that line about suggestions is from the 12 steps, but it applies to sort of the way AA forms itself and is run overall.
And what Bill wrote on why he wrote the 12 traditions, it says, I offer these suggestions neither as one man's dictum nor as a creed of any kind, but rather as a first attempt to portray that group ideal toward which we have assuredly been led these 10 years past. So after 10 years of really going through the trenches with people about how to get communities to operate, these 12 traditions came out directly out of that experience. And it was written down really as a guideline and as lessons learned for future groups.
And I think that's reflected in the name, right? They're not rules, they're traditions, right? This is how we've done it so far, but if you need to do it differently in the future, maybe you change it. Okay, So these are those 12 traditions. Obviously, this is a slide with a horrible amount of text.
And we're not going to read them because we're going to touch on them moving down, but we
Right,
just wanted to have it here so you could see the bolding is our emphasis. It
right.
is not how it is normally printed.
Yeah. But those bold sections were things that, as you'll see further down, we thought were particularly pertinent to Web3. Okay.
So the first two traditions we're going to touch on are traditions 1 and 5. So first of all, like, why do people need AA? Well, they need AA to survive. And how does AA survive? AA unity. And that's what tradition 1 covers. Our common welfare should come first. Personal recovery depends upon AA unity. And then how does AA keep unity? By adhering to its primary purpose, which is tradition 5. Each group, not AA as a whole, but each group has but one primary purpose: to carry its message to the alcoholic who still suffers. So by doing that, you are able to maintain unity of your group. And by doing that, you're able to ensure the unity of the collective. And by doing that, you're able to ensure the survival of the individual.
Right. The thing, this is to me one of the big lessons that we in Web3 can take from the success of AA. Like, how do you grow a DAO to be almost 100 years old and have millions of members in hundreds of countries? Well, why do they need you, right? To stay alive. You don't get to AA by accident, right? If you go to enough meetings for long enough, like you'll probably know people who will stop coming to meetings and start drinking again and die, right? So they need AA in order to literally stay alive. And it's the same thing with, like, why do people go to jobs? Maybe they like their job, maybe they don't, but they keep going to a job because they need money. So, like, to that point, um, why do people need your DAO? Um, Elizabeth, you want to address the questions here?
So, sorry. Ah,
That's okay.
why do people need your DAO? What about your DAO is important to your audience or the people that you think this DAO is relevant for? Why does the community need this DAO? And does your DAO need to last forever, immutably?
And if it does, does your DAO uniquely fill a need that will persist under all circumstances? But this isn't to say, like, if you can't, if you don't have good answers to all these questions, then you just shouldn't do your DAO, right? What we're trying to address here is that as we work on building DAOs, as we work on building decentralized community, these are questions we should be asking ourselves. Uh, Maybe you envision your DAO fulfilling a purpose, but it's not necessarily going to be like an integral, too important to fail piece of infrastructure in the immutable, open, decentralized future, right? So if that's the case, if you can see it existing at least for a while, but it's not going to be some pillar of the blockchain, maybe you don't need to worry so much about every last action being taken by the DAO being completely 110% decentralized and incredibly transparent and on chain forever. It's just a thought. Yeah, and so as you ask yourself these questions, there is a phrase from AA literature that would be helpful, I think. You should ask yourself these questions in a spirit of searching, of a searching and fearless moral inventory, right? So really sort of sit with these questions and be honest as you ask them.
And this is something that DAO last year did address around, like, the death of the DAO and should DAOs die and all of these things, because the early DAOs, like Constitution DAO, really clear primary purpose, super clear primary purpose, right? Once its purpose was achieved, there was no longer a need for the DAO, right? That's like a really excellent example. Raid Guild, a different DAO, where they're trying to decentralize Web3 development work. That one is a little trickier because they're basically sort of trying to act like a decentralized dev shop. which might not be suitable for the DAO structure. It might be, but it might not be, right? So there are lots of DAOs that have, what part of that DAO is most relevant to your primary purpose, and how do you go about really enhancing that? Because if you don't have a primary purpose, then a lot of these other questions really can't get answered, and then you sort of get stuck. So it's
So to
really
that
important.
end,
Mhm.
Elizabeth is talking about primary purpose, and that's not a casual phrasing. That comes from tradition 5. I feel like you were on a roll, Elizabeth. Do you want to continue with this?
Oh, yeah. So tradition 5 says that each group has but one primary purpose: to carry its message to the alcoholic who still suffers. Now that's AA's primary purpose. The question is like, what's your DAO's primary purpose? And once you've established that, we move on to tradition 6, which is an AA group ought never endorse, finance, or lend the AA name to any related facility, outside enterprise, lest problems of money, property, or prestige divert us from our primary purpose.
Can I
So
jump
again,
in right there, Elizabeth?
hold
Jump
on.
in on this bandwagon?
Yeah,
Okay.
are you getting diverted by jumping on the bandwagon, whatever bandwagon? Oliver?
Okay. Yeah. So just a brief historical point. This little oddly specific tradition has a lot of context and history behind it in early AA stuff. AA learned this is basically saying limit scope creep. If I were to translate it to dev talk. There were early experiments in AA about like, oh, we're going to partner with like hospitals and we're going to set up a full-on AA hospital to get people sober, right? But um, you know, AA is a bunch of fucking degens. And so it ended poorly because, of course, the guy who dreamed up the whole thing and got the hospital running,
Went back
uh,
out.
went back out, rugged the hospital, took the bag, so AA was like, okay, no. Let's stay focused. Anyway, I just wanted to throw that in there.
Yeah, but that's really, really, really important to consider, because like which fancy, like the Rockefellers wanted to endorse Alcoholics Anonymous, which fancy chain, which high, backed VC firm like wants to give you money. And is that either diverting you from your primary purpose, or is that creating some kind of scope creep? And it's really hard to turn down some of those opportunities. But if you can't stay focused, right, you're going to end up a very different organization than you intended on from the beginning. And so just really being open and reflexive about those questions is really important. And then we'll move on to tradition 10. So Alcoholics Anonymous has no opinion on outside issues. Hence, the AA name ought never be drawn into public controversy. AA is 89 years old, which is a blip in history. Obviously, it's a blip in like even just historical memory, living historical memory. But it has done nothing but grow, and it essentially has turned into a public good because of the amount of like actual good things it creates in the world. And that's because it doesn't get drawn into public controversy. There are a lot of ways that groups can get drawn into public controversy. And so it's really important that you sort of remain, as Oliver and I like to say, credibly neutral on most things and everything that's not directly affecting how you operate, right?
Right. And
And, go
yeah, go
ahead.
ahead. Oh, okay. So yeah, that's sorry, that I feel like that's a perfect segue into tradition 12. And because one part of this slide that we're talking about here is the primary purpose, right? You have to know what the primary purpose of your DAO, of your group is. And then in executing that, you have to know what your principles are. And I feel like those are two halves of the same coin, right? Your purpose and your principles. And there is this tradition that we must place principles before personalities. And I think the next slide is on this topic. Yes, yeah. So this brings us to some really valuable questions for DAO space and Web3 in general. Because I'm sure if I'm talking about personalities, you can think of some that you know in the space, right? So what what guardrails does your organization have in place to ensure that these issues, power and prestige, you can translate that to money and personality, money and fame. And of course, a lot of what we try to work on in the areas of like tokenomics and governance and stuff is exactly this, right? Um, so what are you doing to ensure that your DAO is staying focused on its primary purpose and not thinking about how you're going to pump the token and exit, right? Or something like that, if you have a token. And another sort of maybe harsh question, but important question, like Elizabeth was mentioning, is does your DAO overlap or compete with other projects in the space? And if you're involved in a DAO, it probably does, because there's so many that are trying to solve cool, important problems. And one thing that I've had to work hard on personally is like not getting scared when I meet another person who says, "Oh, did you know about this one? Oh yeah." Don't get intimidated. Think about how you can build the puzzle together, and also frequently ask yourself the question: at what point are your efforts duplicative? Maybe somebody's doing it better than you, and maybe the best thing for the space as a whole, for the thing, your primary purpose, is to maybe throw in your lot with them, right? So that is, I feel like an important question for us to ask.
And that really hits on why anonymity is the spiritual foundation of the traditions and the steps, because what anonymity allows for is it allows for a lack of ego, right? When you're just a person, a regular bloke, like it's very hard to feel like your opinion is more important than anyone else's. And it gives you that mental clarity to actually do the work. And that's why, again, like the anonymity features within Web3 are really, really interesting as a parallel to the world of 12-step recovery.
Yeah, I like that. We're all just anons, right? Um, yeah, yeah. So do you want to say anything else about this slide, Elizabeth, or should we move on?
No, I think that's good.
Okay. You want to take this one?
Yeah, so the next like big question is like, well, how do you keep your project going, right? Like you have this great idea, you have a great group, you feel like you have a primary purpose, like how do you actually like keep it moving? And we're going to use traditions 4 and 9 here. So number 4 is that each group should be autonomous.
Well, looks like we got kicked out of the church basement there. Classic AA experience. Elizabeth, would you like to pick up where you left off? We were on this slide, right?
Yes. Okay, so how to keep going. Tradition 4, each group should be autonomous except in matters affecting other groups or AA as a whole. So you can see why also like our brains went to, AA, autonomous, DAO, like, even the language is really, really similar when you're reading the literature. So the question is like, how autonomous are you really? Like, how DAOish are you really? And then tradition 9, AA as such ought never be organized, right? Again, organized. But we may create service boards or committees directly responsible to those they serve. So it's really important that when you're conceiving like your DAO, that you allow groups to, parts that you allow the autonomous nature of individuals to thrive, right? So we see this in a lot of different sectors, but philanthropy, funders, like they think they know what you should build, but really you know what you should build. Your community knows what it wants, what's best for it. And so if you're not centering your clients, your community members, actually in the work that you're doing, you're not being autonomous, right? You're being prescriptive. So making sure that you really accept in matters where it really, really affects other groups. Every individual cell is allowed to do its own thing, but remember with the caveat that that thing is that primary purpose. So by definition, you're working toward the same goals, and every group is doing it in the way that is best suited to that group. And that's really what the autonomous part of this tradition means. And it's really interesting in a DAO context when we think about the global nature of a lot of DAOs and the types of applications they're building and how they can be reflexive and responsive to individual communities that they serve. And so from that building perspective, how do we embed that into the DAO's actual work?
Yeah.
And then regarding Tradition 9, like how easy are your committees to join and what are your responsibility mechanisms? So it's not just a matter of like, oh, I can join this subcommittee or this subgroup or this sub-DAO, that there are actual responsibility mechanisms built in to make sure that that work is getting done in an effective way. And as we like to talk about, like the cognitive load of many DAOs is really, really high, or the work is unevenly distributed. So, you know, how can we embrace delegation and decentralization to make that more efficient? And here, a couple of tools, like right off the bat, that came to mind were tools like HATS protocol and Colony. So if anybody has other tooling ideas here, feel free to put them in the chat, or, you know, we can talk about them moving forward or later or whatever. But it's really important that we do have responsibility mechanisms so that the boards, the people who sit on those boards and committees are being effective, because the whole point of having a board or committee is to effectively manage various elements, but very specific various elements. And that's the entire highest level of organization that AA prescribes.
Right. And again, to me, I was thinking about this and like coming back to that, like, are you serving the primary purpose of the DAO thing? Like, if the people on those boards, you know, really have that in mind, like setting aside my ego and focusing on fulfilling the primary purpose of the DAO, there's like that internal motivation part of it as well as external responsibility mechanisms. So I feel like there's two sides to that. Can we move on to the next one, Elizabeth?
Mhm.
All right. So we said at the beginning, the most important one, how do you get paid? We did say that AA was regenerative, and maybe that was a bit of an exaggeration, but in a way it's not. So let me pitch you on it. So the tradition 7 is every AA group ought to be fully self-supporting, declining outside contributions. And like Elizabeth said, there's usually at an AA meeting a moment when they say, in accordance with tradition 7, we will now pass the basket or something like that. But that sort of internal self-funding source has meant that AA hasn't had to rely on the Rockefellers of the world, right? On the VCs of the world, because it found a source of money that wasn't too much of a burden for its users, who are also its members, which is an interesting nuance. And literally, you could keep the lights on in the church basement, right? Your Zoom call didn't go dark. So one of the interesting things about this to me, I think a lot about to what extent public blockchain networks are DAOs. I like to troll people about this actually. So, and this is the way the economics of public blockchain networks have been designed. You know, Facebook isn't out there hosting Ethereum and paying for the gas, although maybe AWS is hosting Ethereum, but that's a separate issue. And they're not paying for it with advertising revenue, right? We're paying for it with every transaction that we send. That's how it works. So we are passing the basket, like on behalf of the group as a whole, on behalf of the DAO of the network. But of course, at lower levels than people who can print money, it gets difficult, right, to find funding that's not a grant or venture capital or something, other, you know, money. So hand wavy money. So it's and it's for a good reason, right? It's hard to get your project up and running without money. So this is like the brutal, honest question that I feel like a lot of DAOs should ask. Although maybe it's easy to get stuck in this and feel like everything's not worth doing. But does your DAO have a way that you can, through your own actions, be sustainable, right? Do you have revenue? If your DAO isn't about that, if it's a social group or if it's some sort of like movement, then go ham, right? But I think a lot of the time, when people talk about a DAO, there's like this thing that comes to their mind of it's like a non-for-profit, man. It's like a public good, and public goods need money too. So, nonprofits can provide services and charge for them. Nonprofit doesn't mean no non-revenue, right? And I think that's a point that we forget too often. All right, Elizabeth, that was my bit.
So
Did you
I
have
also
anything you wanted to add to this? Yeah.
Yeah, a couple of points. One, the VC startup mentality of a DAO really means you're a startup. It doesn't mean you're a DAO, right? So if that's the attitude and the expectation that you have going into how you're going to raise money or how you're going to make money, I would not say that is very decentralized. I would say that's quite centralized. And so, like, is that the right framework for a DAO in terms of revenue? Secondly, AA grew fully organically. Like that's sort of the point we're trying to get across here is that it grew because people saw value in it and they bought into it. They put their dollar in, they put their quarter in. Now people put in like $2 or $3 or still no money because again, it's a fully opt-in payment system. And so it grew as quickly as people wanted to grow it. And so it by full consensus mechanisms, right? And fully internally decided, that's how quickly it grew. And so when thinking about, how is my DAO changing over time? Are we slowing down? Are we speeding up? Did we get any money? Do we have a product to sell? I would challenge people to reframe their time, like think differently about the time frame of their growth. Because like we say, if you want to go quickly, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And this is, I think, really important because it also, you can whittle away at your primary purpose and hone in more and more as you're deciding, what has value to its members. And the more value you can provide to your members, which are your owners, then the more, revenue or more value will be created for your members who are also your owners, right? So that's why, like, basically, unless we're going to start calling DAOs co-ops, which like essentially they are, it's important that we not misconstrue them with a startup.
Yeah.
So AA is not the only self-funded organization in the world. Like there are lots of lending circles and various mechanisms. And like we know how microloans affect communities at large. Like it's not the most effective mechanism for pulling people out of poverty. So again, like when you can decline outside money, we think you should decline outside money. Because what that does is it can very easily and quickly pull you away from your primary purpose, which is the value created and the whole reason you are a DAO.
Nice. Nice. So that brings us to the end of our deck and our presentation. I don't know how much longer we have left on this Zoom call, and if people need to go, but I'm sure that if anybody has any questions, we could field them.
Yeah, and we'll put a link to the deck in
And the video.
Telegram maybe, or in the Discord. And then there's our handles, so you can find us on the social medias. And yeah, thanks for coming. Does anyone have any questions? We can keep it open for a couple minutes. This was also the first time we've given this talk, so feedback would be appreciated, async or, directly to our faces.
That's the count of 7, I believe.
Yep. Thanks, Kara.
Great to see y'all. Thank you.